Ready?
Hello and welcome to the Opening the Dakota Frontier exhibit. My name is Lora Schaunaman, and if you'd step this way, I'm going to introduce you to 4 different groups that were in this area. South Dakota was actually part of the Dakota Territory, which included North and South Dakota and small parts of Wyoming and Montana. So we are in this exhibit, we're going to examine 4 different groups which were living here at the time or moving into this area at the time. The first one is the fur trapper trader that you see here. He's standing by his Red River cart, which is a faithful reproduction of the Red River carts from Ireland, which most of the trappers used in the middle 1800s. They could be pulled by one animal, was the main advantage, and had 2 large wheels, as you can tell, but the entire cart was made of only wood. So all the pegs were used instead of nails. There were no metal parts that had to be replaced because they couldn't out here on the frontier. There were no metal places to get metal screws or nails or anything that could hold together, even metal tools like hammers, unless you brought them with you, were completely unknown. So the trapper and the traders came early to Dakota Territory to both the Elm River in the north part of Brown County and to the James River, which runs east of Aberdeen. And they did a lot of trapping. There were lots of animals, and it was a big market for furs at the time, from about the 1840s to the 1880s. So they always had a good market. Normally they would trap here and go back to the Minneapolis area, where the biggest fur trading post was that they could sell their wares in the summer. So they came in the fall, they stayed till spring, trapping the animals when they had their nicest fur coats on along the rivers, and then they would return there and sell them for cash money, hopefully enough to make it through the next year. Some of the people they traded with were these 2 Lakota man and woman and their village on the banks of this lake. So they would have been here several hundred years before this. They also came from the east, and the Lakota originated in Minnesota and Wisconsin area. And then they moved on to the plains when they were able to get horses and became true plainsmen, excellent riders and hunters in this area. For the most part, the trappers and traders and the Indians or the Native Americans got along well together. There were occasional stories of falling outs, but for the most part, they each had things that the other group wanted. The trappers wanted more furs, enough to fill their whole Red River cart before spring, to the top, and that was their goal. And the natives had furs, a lot of furs they made things out of, so they were willing to trade furs for things they wanted. For instance, the lady that you see, they did a lot of beading even in the early days, but they had to do them with bone needles and pieces of sinew. And when the trappers and traders brought the steel needles and the thread made of cotton, the women really wanted that. So they were always up for a trade with them for furs. And the men always were looking for steel knives or as we've pictured in this exhibit, a Winchester model that was actually only produced by Winchester for 6 years because it wasn't very practical. But the reason the Native Americans wanted it was because of the action, which is made of brass, which also, ironically, was the reason it wasn't very practical. It was too soft of a metal, and Winchester changed to steel just a few years later. But they even had a name for this gun, and they called it the Yellow Boy, because when the sun hit it, it just shone like gold. And they were very excited about that, and so that was the main gun they always wanted to trade for in the early days of the territory. There were also military forts that were stretched across the North and South Dakota expanse of the territory, and I think there were 6 of them, and Fort Sisseton was the one closest to this area of Brown County. Fort Sisseton did not see any battles the whole time the fort was open, which was 14 years, as an active military site. But there were soldiers there the entire time, and their main job was to escort and make sure that the homesteaders were safe. The Homestead Act only coming in after the Civil War in 1865. So many times in South Dakota at Fort Sisseton, the native people came to the fort and traded there. And the soldiers, though they were not supposed to trade any uniform parts, many of them did trade some of their uniform for a buffalo robe, because they just had very limited amounts of clothing for the harsh winters that they found here in Dakota Territory compared to where they had come from before, which was generally the South after the Civil War. Okay, then the last group we're going to talk about is the pioneers, the people that lived in the towns. So in later Dakota Territory, still before statehood in 1889, there were many towns established. Aberdeen itself was established or incorporated in 1881, and many of the towns in Brown County were the same. These were people who were not farmers, they were not traders, they were not military, but they were business people. Because now the homesteaders were coming and they needed banks to borrow money from, to buy seeds for crops, or to buy cattle, and they needed stores to buy the things that they could not produce themselves. So this lady might have been the daughter or wife of a banker, or someone operating a grocery store or a clothing store, and the man the same. They would be people that would have had established the early businesses in the towns. Much of this way of life was over, not their way of life, but the Native Americans living close to civilization by the time, the trappers and traders mostly gone by the time North and South Dakota became states in 1889. So that's where I usually end it, and then take